Good afternoon. You're all welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Judith Namanya, and I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Geography. A special thanks to our panelists. Thank you for responding to our invitations. These are positive. The topic of our discussion today is watershed management, balancing science and traditional knowledge. And we're going to have our panelists make short presentations, 8 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to open the discussion to the audience, Q&A. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to give a definition to some of the keywords. I know to maybe some of us these words are familiar, like some, they're just not as that familiar. So, and I use the dictionary, so no one should hold me accountable if I don't do it well. So, I went to the dictionary, and from the science dictionary, science is the investigation of natural phenomena through observation, theoretical explanation, and experimentation, or the knowledge produced by such investigations. Science makes use of the scientific method, which includes the careful observation of natural phenomena, the formulation of a hypothesis, the conducting of one or more experiments to test the hypothesis, and the drawing of a conclusion that confirms or modifies the hypothesis. Traditional ecological knowledge, or traditional knowledge, is knowledge, know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its culture or spiritual identity. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Dr. Shawn Wilson. Shawn Wilson is the Director of Research at Gnibi, College of Indigenous Australian Peoples, Southern Cross University, and Sub-Dean of Early Career Researchers in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Sydney. His research focuses on the interrelated concepts of identity, health and healing, culture and well-being. His areas of expertise are international Indigenous research methodologies and epistemologies, counseling and counseling education, Indigenous mental health and identity, Indigenous health and well-being. You're welcome, Dr. Shawn Wilson. Our next speaker will be Dr. Erin. She's a visiting assistant professor and associate director of the Center for Water Sciences in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife here at Michigan State University. Her work places a strong emphasis on outreach and engagement with diverse stakeholder groups to implement strategies that protect aquatic ecosystems and maintain valuable ecosystem services. You're welcome. We also have Dr. Donald Shoup join us. He's a fish, wildlife, and social conservationist working for the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. He has experience working on a number of watershed planning projects in Northwest Michigan, among other activities. Our final speaker is Dr. Zarnetske. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Michigan State University. Dr. Zarnetske is an environmental hydrologist who is exploring the hydrodynamic template of catchment ecosystems and groundwater surface water exchange environment. So please help me join hands and welcome our first speaker.
Thanks. I don't need to stand up there. Just come and sit there. I don't really have a prepared speech or anything, so I thought maybe I could just talk a little bit about what the difference is between Western science and Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge. And I think there's not really that big of a difference. It's more of a what's included and what's not included thing. So I'm Shawn Wilson. I'm a Pasquak Cree from northern Manitoba. So I'm a father of 3 boys and a lot of nieces and nephews. And My parents are Stan and Peggy Wilson. My grandparents are, on my dad's side, are Opasquat Cree. We've lived there for a long time. And I guess that's what maybe one of the good starting points is the difference between what our definitions of a long time are. So I hear a lot of Americans say, oh, I'm a 5th generation, 6th, 8th generation American. I think if we look at our oral histories, my people have lived there. We talk in terms of ice ages, so for at least 4 ice ages we've lived in that one area. So as the ice has come forward, we've moved down south, obviously, but always have gone back to the same area to live over 4 different ice ages. So that's the time scale I'm talking about. And I think that that's part of the, if you talk about science being about experiencing your natural environment and learning more about it through experimentation and observation and you know, we've got that many generations of experience with one particular area. We build up quite a bit of a knowledge base over that long. And I think, well, so I was thinking just now about what the difference is between Western science and traditional Indigenous knowledge, and it's really not that big of a difference. I think that if you look at the way Western science works, it's really, well, how the definition of science, and I think a basic definition of science is just a system of knowledge. So it's the systems around which you build your knowledge. Okay, so there's a specific system around how science works in Western that is, oh, well, you know what Western science is because that's what we practice. That's generally, we were just talking about that, it usually doesn't have the Western in front of it because that's just the way society works. It's like, if you think of what white privilege is about, or male privilege, that's sort of like what Western science privilege is. It just gets thought of as science, not Western science, but there are a lot of other types of science that are equally as valid. And I think that the big difference, though, is that what they include. So Western science generally includes observable phenomena, right, that you can do experiments on and can control to a certain extent. Or if you can't control it, you can measure it, maybe a good way to put it. But I think that Indigenous knowledge includes everything that Western science includes, but it also includes more. So it includes things like intuition and things like spirituality. But I always think of it, in Cree there's a term, Pastahowin, which means natural law. I think that's what Western science is about, finding natural laws. So a good example is maybe like a natural law is you don't stand up in a canoe. And a natural law has natural consequences. So if you stand up in a canoe, there's a good correlation that you'll likely end up, someone's going to end up in water. Right? Just realize if you don't know what a canoe is, you wouldn't know what that means. So a canoe is a boat that's like a very low boat and it tips over very easily. So you don't stand up in that kind of a boat. Otherwise, the consequence is someone's likely going to end up in the water. So that's a good sort of analogy, I think, of what Western science is about. So that's Pastahowin, just natural laws. In Cree, there was also another word, though, Chinawin, which is harder to translate, but it sort of translates into sacred law. So I think that that's what Indigenous science is about, is looking at Pastahowin, looking at natural law, but it's also looking at Chinawin, which is sacred law. And I think that if I carry that analogy further with the don't stand up in a boat or someone's going to fall out, if you look at sacred law, it's more like thinking along the lines of don't disrespect water. Okay. So it has more to do with how you behave yourself. So it's not just what you do, it's why you're doing it. And so that that intention becomes a lot more important in Indigenous science, so why you're doing things. It's a lot of Indigenous science is really based on foundation of relationships. So knowledge itself is in a relationship, and you're developing a relationship with knowledge as you engage in science. So think about how am I engaging in a relationship? Well, engaging relationships with other people, you know, some are good relationships and some are not so good. So if you start thinking about that relationship with how you're engaging with knowledge, are you in a relationship that's a loving and two-way relationship, or are you in an abusive relationship? So that's the sort of thing that we have to start taking into account. Because if you're in an abusive relationship, it's not going to be really healthy, right? So if you're in an abusive relationship with knowledge, if you're there to use knowledge as a way of exerting control over and dominating something, it's going to create a different type of knowledge than if you're in a relationship that's two-way and healthy and giving back. So I think that's what it's all about. So that's why it includes, when you start to talk about things being sacred, it's not talking about religion, it's talking about behaving yourself in a proper way. That's really the heart of it, and that's, to me, it's not the difference really, because I think most Western scientists follow that same way. It's just not part of the scientific method usually. Because that's usually not a good, I mean, you know, not an indicator of when you're doing an experiment. Well, did you behave yourself properly? That's not a test of, you know, validity. It is for Indigenous science. So if you're going to live on one area for several thousand years, you'll learn how to behave yourself. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shawn. Let's speak up this one. Erin, you're welcome.
Or you can take the hot seat.
I actually have slow Let's drink some. And I'm going to pick up on the relationship comment, because what I'm going to talk about is how we engage stakeholders in watershed management. That's my background. So it's back of my head, working with a group of stakeholders, developing a plan to protect endangered fishes in a watershed just outside of Atlanta. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of things that, you know, when I'm thinking about how you incorporate different ways of knowing or different types of knowledge into these types of plans, a couple of things that have at least stood out to me. And the first one is the EPA and their guidance on how you develop a watershed management plan. And then the second that I'll get into a little bit more is this idea of engaged research. So how many of you are familiar with EPA's guidance on watershed management? A little bit, okay. I wasn't sure, so I included it. They actually have this nice little 400-page document on how you develop a watershed management plan. And their take is basically this kind of process. And, you know, they start out with building relationships and building partnerships. And then you get into kind of the nitty-gritty of developing the plan, implementing the plan, and adapting. So this is basically their take on the process. And what I want to focus on is that first bit of building partnerships. And that very first step in whatever you do is identifying key stakeholders. And EPA actually identifies who those key stakeholders are. So all of this is text, just right out of their guidance document. So if you are a key stakeholder, if you are in one of those 5 groups of people, right? And you can see that this is all focused on getting us to a watershed management plan. And I focus on this because if you want any Clean Water Act funding for what you're doing, typically you have to meet EPA guidelines for watershed management plans to be eligible for that funding. So this is driving a lot of the management plans that we see in states. And when it gets to, okay, so what is in those plans? You know, hopefully we have people who will be implementing it, they're effective in some way, they can contribute to the plan involved, and then they're all going to be working together to come up with these 9 different things, right? This horribly ugly table, again, right out of EPA's document. And you can see that, you know, it's everything from identifying causes and sources of pollution, you know, water quality problems, into developing waste load allocations and getting into some really technical information. And what's typically used here is your traditional Western science type of information, right? But they do acknowledge the importance of local knowledge, not necessarily traditional knowledge, but just saying local knowledge, any kind of anecdotal information from your stakeholders can be really valuable to all of these different elements of a management plan. And so you want to be working with stakeholders throughout the development of the plan. Now there's been a wide range of success. I don't know if we'll hear about some of those in our other speakers, but typically what we see is if we have some engaged local stakeholders, your plan is typically going to have a better chance of success in terms of actually being implemented and actually seeing water quality improvement in the long run. So that brings me to my next topic. You know, we have this EPA kind of being set the official framework of, all right, we need these different types of elements in a plan. It's really driving a lot of what's being done, but the other thing that's going on is a shift to engaged research. And this really gets away from seeing stakeholders as the people out there in the watershed that you might meet with at the beginning of a project, kind of in the middle, and then you come back at the end. The key word here is they are partners, and so they're collaborators, and you're getting to a place where you're co-generating knowledge. So this is just an example from a project that we did out in Lake St. Clair, and these are our stakeholders. None of these people are scientists, and they are developing ecosystem models. So we asked them to draw how the human system interacts with the natural system, and you can see they come up with all sorts of ways the system interacts. We actually took all of that information, built a simplified model, went back to that group, asked them about the questions that they were interested in, what problems were they facing, what issues were they facing, what were their needs. Did they have information on how some of these things interacted? And we were able to go even further and develop system dynamics models and how all of these different pieces of this small watershed interact with one another. Some of these relationships we had no scientific data for. We based these types of relationships on the local knowledge of the system. And it's all set up so you can go in and you can tweak one bit and see what the consequences are. And so this essentially turned into a decision support tool for the local community. So all of this driven by the local stakeholders. So instead of sort of stepping in and we're going to research you, it was essentially thinking of, well, what is the need in the community? What do you know? What can we do? How do we work together? So on the science side, we're essentially looking at development of ecosystem models and modeling procedures. And then on the local side, they're getting decision support tools. We also worked with them to digitize all of their data. So there is something really of value to this community produced by participating. And we learned about the system together. We've also worked up in Traverse Bay using this framework. It's a framework developed by Michigan Sea Grant called an integrated assessment. And basically it sets up sort of classic stakeholders on one side, researchers on the other. What's a little bit different about this is that there's actually a lot more interaction between the two groups as you're moving along in this. Again, it's a way to do engaged research where the scientists are taking care of some of the more technical aspects of trying to answer questions. In this case, we're thinking of different climate adaptation options for the region. But the questions, the information available, what was valuable to the community, what they wanted to see, that was all driven by the local stakeholders, not the scientists. Okay. I will end there.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mr. Donald.
My name is Donald Shook. I typically go by DJ Shook. And I'll just stay here in comfortable spots. Just a brief introduction on my background. I graduated from the University of Michigan, the School of Natural Resources Management, Ecology and Management, and I went to work in implementing watershed restoration directly out of undergrad. And I've been in the field ever since. I've worked in Washington State as a crew supervisor for a Conservation Corps crew. I then worked for Conservation District in Washington State, helping farmers deal with fish passage and entrainment concerns on endangered steelhead and salmon in the fields that they were using, fields that they were irrigating with stream water. And then most recently, I work under a partnership agreement between the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians up out of Traverse City, Michigan. So I'll give a brief introduction to both of those entities, because most people aren't super familiar. So the easiest one is the USDA NRCS. I've heard used several times. There's the sister agency to the Natural Resources Conservation Service is the Forest Service. The Forest Service is responsible for conservation on all federally owned forest land. NRCS is responsible for conservation on the rest of the land base in the United States. So it's typically privately owned, sometimes it's state or locally owned, but the conservation programs are more of an incentive type. They're trying to trick land managers into doing good conservation versus the federal forest land, they can just do it. So the programs are typically different, but the science base is the same. So when we work on road stream crossings, we use the Forest Service's stream simulation model when we have the ability to do that. And fish passage is one of the main things that I work on, so I'm very familiar with that methodology. So that's the easy one, is NRCS. The Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians is one of 12 federally recognized tribes in the state of Michigan. And I've worked in my position for about 5 years, and what I've learned through attending speeches or working groups is that at least in Michigan and throughout the United States, the story of the tribes in the United States is very heavily influenced by the legal system and laws, treaties, and consent decrees. So it's quite a bit of study to really understand the full story of federal recognition, non-recognition, then re-recognition, and then all of the different rights that were written into the treaties protected for the tribal members and then not really recognized, and only very recently, 2007 was the last consent decree between the state of Michigan and one of 5 tribes, one of them being the tribe that I work for. So it's very, there's a lot of study and understanding in the legal framework, and just to get the basics on that. So there are 8 different treaties in Michigan that pertain to the tribes, those 12 tribes. Two of them pertain to the tribe that I work for. And the one major one that pertains to my work is the 1836 Treaty of Washington. There's currently 5 federally recognized tribes that are affected by that treaty. And it was, I've heard it explained, there was a wave of relocation of Native Americans from their ancestral lands out west as settlement happened from the East Coast, moving inwards towards the Midwest and eventually Western United States. But they missed Michigan. They just kind of blew past Michigan. And then eventually the settlers turned their heads north and said, well, wait a second. And so the what's known as the Trail of Tears happened before 1836, before this treaty was signed with the tribe that I work for. And so in an effort to avoid being relocated from their ancestral lands, this treaty was signed to rather cede land to the United States, but retain a small reservation that you couldn't really do much with, but at least you didn't have to move. And then the ceded territory was written into the treaty that the tribes would have rights to hunt, fish, gather, and other usual privileges of occupancy on that land, as long as it wasn't needed for settlement. So there's, that's in itself something that you could argue on a legal basis, but what it means after the 2000 consent decree, after the latest interpretation of that language, was that public land, the tribes have right to fish, hunt, gather, camp under their own licensing protocol. They're not regulated by the state of Michigan for hunting and fishing. And the ceded territory for the 1836 is most of northwest lower Michigan and most of the eastern upper peninsula, and then the Great Lakes waters that is adjacent to that land. So it's a pretty large territory. And so my position as a joint position between USDA and NRCS is interested in conservation outside of federally owned forest land and the Grand Traverse Band. They have shared interest in coordinated conservation for resources that both the government, the United States government, and the Grand Traverse Band have an interest in conserving. So I get involved in a lot of different types of projects, and a few of them with the Boardman River Dam removal and river restoration project. I'm following up one of the first dam removals with the in-stream habitat project. It actually is contractors mobilizing on that project today. So hopefully they don't get too far into it. They're not allowed to get in the stream until next week, so I'm on a steering committee for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, which is a local coordinated invasive species management network. And in our region, we're just kicking off 15-county fish passage and farmland protection project aimed at protecting the cold water fishery resources of the inland southern portion of the ceded territory, lower Michigan. And then I'm also working with the Michigan Lake Area Management Plan working group to develop a Lake Michigan plan under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the U.S. and Canada. So just early on, I was really interested. When I was going to school, I was introduced to the concept of traditional ecological knowledge. I had a class and we went out to Walpole Island. We were discussing forestry, plot management, and it was just mentioned that First Nation people from Walpole Island, I think they're recognized by Canada, they had when they would see forests that were managed in southeast Michigan, some of the ones here, and they would see the underbrush and some of the, it was very difficult to see through some of the forest land. It was just looked bad or looked not right. And I think they had a tradition, and still do to this day have a tradition, of someone on the island just sets a fire, and then after you see the smoke, you go and set a fire around your house and you burn back the underbrush from your house away from your house, so that the fire doesn't consume where you live. And it's a management practice of burning forest land or burning brush land, and this was Lake Plain Prairie, oak prairie, so it was very sparsely vegetated. But that knowledge of what a woodlot should look like was just really intriguing to me, a traditional ecological knowledge that could be used in small-scale management. And then just one other example, just recently, and this was outside of my workings with the Grand Traverse Band, but I heard it talking about watershed management and just big-scale sustainability for planning. And someone mentioned, so I'll just use me as an example. I've been married for 11 years, and how would you feel about the relationship between me and my wife if I told you that our marriage was sustainable? So I think that gets to your point, Shawn, about the relationship in watershed management, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. Is it's sustainable is such a low bar when you have plans or watershed management. It's if you're really in a loving relationship, and so.
Millions of questions, but from your experience in the tribe, and I will talk also to Shawn about this, how close are you related with the passing on of the knowledge about nature to the children today, the system that exists, how you pass on the knowledge, how the elders pass on in your tribe, and as I can say to you too, what are the systems pass on the knowledge that the elders will pass on their knowledge. So the way, I'm sorry, I'm an anthropologist from the University of California, and I work with Native Americans since about the quarter of a century in the Southwest, and every week for 22 years in this community, and my major, the closest, to say friends, elders are from the Manitoban Islands, and that some are also, I think, from the tribe.
And we have one more speaker, and it's going to give a presentation, and then we're going to
Oh,
open
okay.
it up for
Okay, I'm
discussion. So
sorry.
if you can just wait 8 more minutes,
Oh,
that'd be
I'm
great.
sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you for.
So, our final speaker is Dr. Zarnetske.
I thought I wasn't going to have to introduce myself. So I'm in the hot seat here. Let's see if I can. So I'm also more of a specialist, I guess, from Erin's category here, and therefore I have slides.
There's only three.
There's only three. Yeah, so. So I'm trying to think, so yes, I'm very much the consummate scientist, probably the most consummate scientist sitting on this this panel today. And it's important always to remember one's history, especially when I think of traditional knowledge. I think of a lot of place-based knowledge. Maybe that's my naive perception, but place matters, and knowledge is built in a place for a lot of people. So here's my places, and you can see I'm a bit of a spatially dynamic person. I started in the Northeast, went to college, and I went to the private sector in Boston. Then I fell in love with my now wife, and the Western United States. I went to graduate school in Utah, then proceeded to move west again to Oregon. And then before I finished my PhD, I was awarded a fellowship to do some international research and moved even further west yet again to New Zealand, where I actually had probably my most intimate experience with traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples, working for the National Water and Atmospheric Research there. Then I jumped all the way back to Oregon, defended my PhD, moved on to Yale. So I moved back east, and here I am 3 years now, somewhere in the middle. Is what my wife and I say. We ended up in the middle here, so I'm at Michigan now, in Earth and Environmental Sciences. So that's my history. So each one of these places, I stuck my toe into or experienced indirectly traditional knowledge. Sometimes I didn't even know it, but I've seen a lot through these places. One thing I've realized, being a relatively objective scientist, is everything is about perspective. So take a moment. This is an exercise I do a lot when I'm presenting, is I show people a picture and I ask them to just look at it. Think about it. What are you seeing here? This is an iconic photograph by Ansel Adams, one of America's treasures. And if you look at it, I bet everybody in this room, if you wrote it on a piece of paper and you handed it up to me, there'd be very little overlap in terms of one specific feature or thing that you're looking at or thinking about at this moment in time. And for me, what I see when I see these photographs all the time is I see connectivity. Right? My perspective is about the connections that water makes between the different aspects that you see in this photograph. How water connects the atmosphere to the mountains and the hillsides, and is connected to the rivers. How terrestrial ecosystems are connected to aquatic ecosystems, as well as how our native lands, right, and the different lands that we're interested in protecting, preserving, are connected to our urban lands and our urban environments, right? There's a common theme there. Water is a part of all of them, and water connects all of them. So my knowledge, my perspective is to study water, right? I think about water first when I want to approach bigger, more complicated problems, right? And by doing that and going to those different places, I've been able to participate in socio-technological aspects of the environment, pure physical, like geography questions, ecological systems, as well as the chemistry and the water resources. So some quick examples. That trip to New Zealand really threw me into a rapidly dynamic system where China decided they wanted much more dairy all of a sudden. So New Zealand's grassland shifted from raising wool to raising cows, dairy cows. That totally changes the hydrology of the system, high management land, and they did it quite literally overnight, or within 1 year. That dramatically changed water resources, nutrients, and started wiping out these freshwater eels that were sacred to the Maori peoples across both islands. All right? And so traditional knowledge immediately met current economics and Western science. In the Pacific Northwest, how do we protect our coasts to changing energy regimes due to raising sea level, climatic? Right? Anybody who lives in the Pacific Northwest and knows family knows right now things are insane for them. They're getting hit storm after storm after storm. And those coastlines, how does the movement of water against those coastlines change? The other place where really, especially right about now in my life, that traditional knowledge has been important is understanding Arctic systems, right? So I go up there to study Arctic watersheds, which are predominantly influenced by frozen ground, right? And there's very, very, very sparse populations up there, and huge migrations for the people and the animals in that environment. And lastly, where most all of my research and sort of my published knowledge and domain is in watershed carbon and nutrient cycling. Right? This is again a ubiquitous phenomena that we have across any of our watersheds that we're interested in, is what we do on land changes what happens in the water. Right? So, by water being my perspective, I get to play and think and hopefully help with all of these different aspects. Okay, and the more nerdy way, I've got some mantras that we say in our lab, some things that I like all of my students and me to think about all the time is when we approach these complicated problems, the tools that we bring to the trade is the theory of hydrology and how it relates to the theory and the knowledge base of biogeochemistry. Right? So we take these two theories and we bring them together. We try to create a marriage between the two of them to create new field experiments and models, right? And the idea is to develop new paradigms, new understanding, right? And to really boil it down, and this is overly simplified, but it's easy to remember, is I approach these complicated systems in the sense that physics sets the limits and the biology gets it done. Now there's a huge asterisk there in that humans can trump both systems. We're pretty good at manipulating both. But really, how does just a physical template, or as was quoted earlier, the hydrogeomorphic template, set the terrain for life? Now, I mentioned this part of the world, right? This is a polar view of the planet. We're looking at the North Pole here. And so you see Alaska is up here, right? And then Northern Asia, Siberia, Europe, Greenland. Okay? That purple, that rich colored purple that you see there is the area that's dominated by frozen ground. Right? That's permafrost. It represents that area. It's about 24% of the northern hemisphere's land surface. Right? In it is massive amounts of carbon, right? And nutrients and sediment that's bound in ice, relatively inactive, right? On year-to-year, generation-to-generation timescales until now. It's rapidly warming. That ice is thawing. Seasons are changing up there, right? Seasons are really important to traditional knowledge. Seasons are changing. The springs are getting longer, as are the summers and the fall, and the winter is getting shorter. That's changing that permafrost. That's changing the ecology and that physical template very rapidly up there. And yet, so little of us know anything about this because nobody knows anybody who's ever gone up there and seen it with their eyes. Here is where traditional knowledge is probably one of the most valuable pieces of knowledge we have to bring to a planetary issue. So I wanted to throw that in. This is something I did it about a decade ago, and not until this past year was reintroduced to or had the opportunity to get to this distant location. So think about images like this, defining that landscape up there. It's frozen, it's locked in place, and now, many more days, many more months of the year, it's looking more like this, okay? And so, traditional knowledge actually brought me back up there. It was a bush pilot who's been flying up there for 30 years, taking scientists, adventurers, rafting guides, people in and around, and one of the places they love to land, because that tundra landscape up there is hummocky. It's not easy, it's rough terrain. And even though they got big balloon tires, where they land, it still needs to be pretty flat. And it's these river gravel bars in these plains is where they like to land. And he said, the places I've landed for year after year after year aren't there anymore. Things are changing. So these pilots actually are the ones who were some of the first detections of these changes. And that's led to proposals and me getting back up there. And it all started with a conversation with somebody who had 30 years with no scientific knowledge, but just with their eyes looking down on the landscape.
Thank you so much. Another round of applause to our panelists. So, questions? I'll take the questions. So, questions?
So your question was, how do, say, tribal elders transfer knowledge to the youth?
The system that exists today within the tribe.
So there's a,
School, I think there is something that how is it new?
so for the Grand Traverse Band, and it's probably a familiar story for tribes in northern Michigan at least, is that it was the older generation remembers being told not to speak the language and being, so they had parents that were fluent Anishinaabe speakers, but they were told not to speak that outside of the home. So many of the older generation, or many of the oldest generation now is, they can understand the native language, but they can't speak it because they heard it in their home, but they weren't allowed to speak it outside of the home. And they were instructed not to even learn as children. And so I think that, and it's true with programs within the Grand Traverse Band, is that the language contains so much of the knowledge of the tribe because they relied on an oral history for generations. So stories were so important, and then local dialects and words for different of describing certain things actually.
Yeah, it's a descriptive language.
Yes, exactly.
We work on this every week
Okay.
with the elders, the few that are left with us for all those years. So, and interestingly, also there are a lot of French words that I'm telling them how you pronounce it actually. Right.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of information, yes, on every word, and there are only one or two or three elders left here that can actually link the word to actually the practice of this world, I mean the reality of the world, and they are lining out. And also in relation to the language, there is a lot of big controversy between other people who teach Ojibwe language. So the new way one is to be very grammatical, very like we teach English, you know, to learn the verbs and all of that. And so the people I know, the elders I know, who would immediately explain a word and why it's in this order in a sentence, how it relates to the practice, what people were doing, like eating or cutting trees or all of that. So all of this is really dying out because the pressure of the new people. They have a meeting every year, very big meeting up north to talk about, like Sault Ste. Marie, I think, to talk about how do you teach Ojibwe language. And there are a lot of controversy. So my teacher, and our teacher here, is one of our, is teaching at U of M. And I don't know if I want to hear all of this, because it's a big important issue.
But there also is culture camps, right, at all the many of the tribes in Michigan. You're talking about asking how the knowledge is passed down, and many of the tribes have culture camps. But I had a question for the whole panel. I'm a Anishinaabe from Michigan, so Miigwech, thank you all for coming here. And so you can hear some of the language of the people that are Indigenous from here. I'm Little River Band from Michigan, so I'll do the Michigan thing up here. But I wondered, I work for the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Namanya Nation, and I'm a PhD student here in community sustainability. And I sit across the table when we do planning for climate change work with tribes to the Northeast region, which is backwards, but defined by the USGS as Maine to Minnesota down to Kentucky, so 87 federally recognized tribes. And there's always these conversations, right, of how do you talk to somebody else from a very different epistemology or a very different way of knowing and being. So I want to ask, what are the practical suggestions that you all have for how do you have those conversations when they can be very hard and there can be very, a lot of money at stake, a lot of power at stake. I mean, you're talking about the difference between a stakeholder and a partner. That's a power differential that in Canada, the co-management issues that have happened there. So how do you have those conversations, and is there practical suggestions that you guys can have for us young ones that are coming up? Or if it's not comfortable about traditional knowledge, somebody from a different discipline that you have to communicate with. So
I have maybe a familiar example to your question, maybe not exactly. But one of the projects I'm working on, it's a Grand Traverse Band initiative, but we applied to the federal government to get assistance for farmland protection and fish passage projects, be it dam removal or road stream crossing replacements. And so we had 20 different entities collaborating together on this project, and there's 3 separate land conservancies and a few other local nonprofit groups. And in developing the early stages of our project, where we were required